There are no dangerous opinions, only dangerous people with an opinion. Good evening once again, everybody. This is Hell's Unicorn again. And this evening, I am going to be opining regarding two subjects. One of them specific, the other a bit more general. The specific subject has to do specifically with a petition that was started, I believe, earlier today, in which it is being mulled over whether or not Piers Morgan, the famed CNN personality, should be deported for trying to destabilize the country and to plunge us into a despotism. Or, in other words, he's trying to disarm the entire population while continuing his usual brand of crypto-Zionistic warmongering. As you can probably gather from my language, I'm not a big fan of Piers Morgan for a number of reasons. I generally don't like Irish people who kiss the ring of the crown of England and think that all of the British Isles should be united. Just as a general rule, it doesn't agree with me. And I also find it annoying when I encounter English-sounding Irishmen, or more specifically, Irish people who have adopted an English accent. Just doesn't sit well with me. I come from a long line of Irish dissidents, some of whom, going back a couple of generations, had family that were involved in the IRA. I'm not an advocate of violence in that regard necessarily, unless violence is first visited upon Ireland, but I like the idea of Irish sovereignty, and Piers Morgan doesn't like the idea of sovereignty, period, unless it's the sovereignty of the arbitrary power of those whom govern over large land masses, for lack of a better term. I got into a bit of a discussion with a fellow libertarian on this topic, and I've come to understand a few things, not only about myself, but about the libertarian ideology as it stands. There are multiple different shades of libertarianism, and as such, some have rightly begun to question whether or not there is any coherence to the concept to begin with, because you have all these competing definitions. Some libertarians think that the idea of having, universal health care within some capacity might not be a bad idea. You have some that think, much like Friedrich Hayek, that there is a place for military interventionism within a limited statist government. There are some libertarians that would espouse anarchistic views, either of a right-wing or a left-wing persuasion. The only thing that really seems to unite all of these differing branches of libertarianism is this concept of liberty. The problem is that is in name only. You have different branches with different ideas of what exactly liberty is. So I'm going to begin this little diatribe that I'm about to engage in by qualifying my own definition of what libertarianism is and what liberty means as a consequence. I believe that liberty is the ability for the will to act in a matter as it ought, without fear of repression via force. This is in contrast to numbers of other people within the libertarian movement who simply want to abolish the initiation of force. The problem with a simple blanket abolition of the initiation of force is that, in my view, because of the inherent corruption that I believe that mankind has by nature, that it could never possibly be followed. Just like I have a very pragmatic view regarding gun ownership. I believe that criminals will be criminals, regardless to what the law says. Such as the old internet meme goes, excuse me. So you think that more gun control would have stopped the Colorado shootings, or in this case, the Connecticut shootings? Please, tell me again about how criminals follow gun laws. Ultimately, what we have here is a competition not between differing brands of liberty, as far as I'm concerned, but differing understandings of human nature. I believe that in many respects, libertarianism has allowed itself to be influenced by utopian ideas and tabula rasa epistemology. In other words, they believe that everybody's born with a blank slate and everybody can be molded to fit a certain norm in certain particular circumstances. Henceforth, people are inherently either neutral or they're inherently good. It's misguided idealism with Aristotelian roots, for lack of a better definition. The thing is, if you don't hold to the tabula rasa viewpoint, which I don't, I favor a split between genetic determinism and environmental determinism of about, I'd say, 65% to 35%. And within the context of specific determinisms, both genetic and environmental, there arises the freedom of the will through the will to act. I do not believe that a person wills the will. I do not believe that people can act in contradiction to their own will. I believe that the will can change through physical corruption and through disease, but this is a different species and a different subject. I'm concerned more specifically with the efficacy of the will in its fully efficacious and lucid state. A person that is capable of reasoning, of realizing that 2 and 2 equals 4, and is thus able to make moral judgments based on discernible facts which surround him. He can err. He can make mistakes, but he has the capacity to learn from them and to adapt to new situations accordingly. That is the context of which I am speaking here. So I'm not really interested in entertaining any discussions about different mental diseases or other impairments that can corrupt the will to act. A person is not capable of changing their own will, in other words, except for maybe through self-mutilation. In keeping with this, if you accept the basic principle that man, by nature, is corruptible or is internally conflicted or is internally wicked, whichever one of those beliefs you subscribe to, if you don't subscribe to the notion that man is either implicitly neutral or implicitly good, you cannot, in good conscience, advocate for any eventuality where a person is left defenseless to others who are not bound by any sympathy for the laws of a given area which others conform themselves to. Henceforth, I don't view the right to keep and bear arms or weapons of any individual's choosing as something that's up for debate. It is a self-evident fact that if one person can have access to something, barring certain very extreme exceptions, others should have it. If one person cannot have it, then it becomes a moral imperative that nobody should have it, in other words. As far as I'm concerned, it's all or nothing. That is my theoretical understanding of the right to keep and bear weapons. Naturally, there is a practical outcome which makes this not exactly possible. Resources are scarce, therefore, by virtue of resource scarcity, not everybody can have exactly the same thing at the same time. I'm speaking more as a general principle regarding what people should have access to if they are able to work for and acquire. Other words, I'm basically disseminating property rights. The reason why I find all of this to be relevant is because the discussion that I had with this other particular libertarian circled around whether or not we, as voting citizens of these United States of America, have the right to petition for the deportation of a corrupting cultural influence on our country. That is the nature of the debate as far as I'm concerned, because I view Piers Morgan as a corrupting influence. Anybody who brings over the slavishness of post-1996 Britain into this country, as far as I'm concerned, is no different than somebody who's trying to subject this country to Sharia law. It's basically a westernized version of the same general concept of corruption via governmental despotism. Excuse me. My opinion on the matter follows as such. There are certain instances where the rights that are guaranteed under the Constitution terminate upon a certain specific area. In other words, there comes a point where if two amendments come into conflict with each other, that there has to be a resolution and one has to come out on top. That is my viewpoint on the matter, and as such, there are built-in restrictions regarding the realities of these liberties guaranteed to us via the Constitution. When they are practically introduced into society, there are borders that have to be drawn in order for them to be practical. Just like with mathematics, in theory, numbers can go on from 0 to infinity and in the opposite direction on the negative side of the spectrum. There is nothing inherent in mathematics that limits the amount of numbers you can come up with. However, practically speaking, in order to have specific applications to material existence, mathematics has to be subjected to certain standards in order to limit its scope, thus making it useful. By the same token, we come to the issue of free speech, because the shield that Piers Morgan is holding up in the name of trying to deprive this country of its traditional right to keep and bear arms is this notion of free speech. It is his free speech to undermine our freedom to keep and bear arms. It's a method of using freedom to destroy freedom. As such, we come to a little quandary here, which is as follows. The individual who I have been conversing with argues that we as libertarians have no right to tell others what they can and cannot say. The problem with this kind of a broad, overreaching statement is it basically implies that we, in turn, can do nothing if NAMBLA goes around and spreads around the idea that people should be allowed to molest children with impunity. And in turn, let's say, hypothetically, enough people in this country accepted that viewpoint. Would that be a good moral outcome? Because there are instances in history where nation states have adopted pedophilia as a common cultural practice. Ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Egypt, ancient China. Even to this day, in the so-called ultra-conservative Middle Eastern Islamic countries, you find a lot of cases of man-boy love, for lack of a better term. When I used this analogy, I was greeted with scoffs. But the analogy holds pretty firm as far as I'm concerned. If there is no cutoff point from where one liberty begins and another one ends, then ultimately one liberty will come to trump all the others, and the entire concept of liberty as a result is removed from its practical, real applications. In other words, freedom of speech simply becomes a floating abstraction, and as a result, anybody is free to say anything and to use those things which are said to enact government policy, which in turn will have very real and forceful consequences. I've put a link in the description regarding the Catholic concept of probabilism, just to give you an example of how simply arguing something from an abstract viewpoint and not actually putting it in real-world terms can actually lead to other things. For instance, saying that morally lax practices in theory are okay to muse over, in turn can lead to moral laxity in practice. The thing is, all practices, all mannerisms, all modes of action begin in a practical or theoretical stage before they become a reality. So saying that something is just simply an assertion without the weight of force behind it is fairly misleading. All ideas which eventually end in tyranny and mass murder begin in a practical academic sense. And the reason why they're allowed to get that far is ultimately because they're not nipped in the bud when they first start to blossom. Now, one can argue, is it a good idea to just simply go around deporting everybody with controversial viewpoints? My assertion to this is absolutely not. However, there is a cutoff point where someone crosses the line and gets into an area where we have to be concerned about whether or not our liberties can withstand the freedom of speech of a particular person with a controversial viewpoint. Now, controversial viewpoints, that can be a little subjective. It depends specifically on what we're talking about. I would argue that holding the viewpoint that everybody should have guns or that nobody should have guns are both equally controversial in differing respects. But I would argue that the assertion that only government agents should be allowed to own firearms is dangerous, it's corrupt, and it should not be tolerated. Now, as to the specific nature and the inevitable outcome of this particular petition, I don't think Barack Obama gives a rat's ass about what the people want done. I don't think he ever has. I think he went in there with certain ideas and he's going to try to act on them if he can, and he will only desist if he encounters enough opposition. So I don't think that this petition is going to be taken seriously. In fact, I doubt Obama will even consider it. But one person who may indeed consider it is Piers Morgan. When he realizes that within the span of a couple days, nearly 30,000 people want him out of the country, and that number will probably grow exponentially before the 20th of January when this petition terminates, he might think twice about running his mouth. And that, in turn, can be seen as a parallel to the very nature of the Second Amendment. The fact that everyone has access to guns very much functions as a deterrent. It's not a complete deterrent. There are people that will do what they want to do come hell or high water. But I would argue that there is a deterrent effect in the very enshrinement of the Second Amendment itself. And similarly, the idea that the people would entertain forcefully removing this jackass Fox Patty from this country, as far as I'm concerned, that's even better than actually removing him from the country. And telling you right now, as a proud Irish American, if Obama, by some strange miracle, actually took this petition to heart and deported Piers Morgan tomorrow, I would be dancing the jig. I would be filming it and I would be putting up on YouTube, regardless of how embarrassing it would be, since I can't dance worth a crap. Even if Piers Morgan enjoyed American citizenship, I would still favor this petition. And I would not seek to deny Piers Morgan his constitutional rights as a result. He could have his day in court. He could be judged accordingly. And we have laws on the books dealing with this. It's called sedition. And after he gets his day in court, he gets sent out of here, sent packing. I say good riddance to good rubbish. We've got one less corrupting force in the mainstream media. A lot more left to go. But you have to understand that speech is like any other tool. It can be used to build up, or it can be used to tear down. It can be used to build great feats of wonder and pristine beauty, and it can be used to mutilate, to maim, nay, even to destroy. And I would argue that most in the mainstream media are in the demolition business. And with that, I leave you. Until next time, with prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you, good evening.